Dennis Brooks, a powerful millionaire, watches his world crumble as his only son Owen battles a mysterious illness. In the darkest hours of the hospital, a fragile voice breaks through the silence. "Please, sir, I can save your son." The voice belongs to Grace, a homeless girl, dirty, desperate, but with eyes that hold something impossible to ignore. Dennis dismisses her, but Grace refuses to give up. And when he finally gives in, everything starts to change. Want to find out what happens? Watch until the end and brace yourself for a twist no one could see coming. Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Dennis Brooks had built an empire from the ground up. His name was synonymous with power, success, and wealth. Boardrooms trembled at his presence, and entire markets shifted with his decisions. But none of that mattered now. None of it meant anything as he sat slumped in a cold, sterile hospital room, his head buried in his hands. Just feet away, his only child, Owen, lay motionless on a hospital bed, his frail body dwarfed by tubes and wires that seemed to stretch like prison chains. The 10-year-old boy, once so full of light and laughter, was reduced to a pale shadow, his chest rising and falling with shallow, mechanical breaths. Doctors came and went, their words a blur of jargon and false reassurance. "We're doing everything we can. We'll keep you updated. You have to prepare yourself for the worst." Dennis couldn't remember the last time he'd slept. His eyes were raw from tears he couldn't afford to shed. He was a man of power, after all, a man who solved problems. But this was beyond him. No amount of money or influence could buy his son's recovery. He had spent millions already, hiring specialists, funding research, even commissioning experimental treatments from the most renowned scientists in the world. But it was all useless. Every attempt ended in failure, every new doctor shaking their head with that same apologetic look Dennis had grown to despise. "Your son may not survive another week," they had said. The words repeated in his mind like a haunting melody. Dennis's days were spent in that hospital room, pacing the floor, murmuring words of reassurance to the unconscious boy, promises of trips they'd never take, adventures they'd never share. His words were hollow, and he knew it, but he couldn't stop. Talking to Owen was the only thing that kept him sane. Yet deep down, his heart was as cold as the hospital, walls surrounding him. It wasn't grief that consumed him, at least not entirely. It was rage, a blinding, scorching rage at the universe for daring to take his son from him. And worse, a rage at himself for being so helpless. When doctors approached him with sympathetic tones, he lashed out, demanding answers, threatening lawsuits, throwing his money around as if it could rewrite fate. But even he knew it was all a desperate act. A crumbling man trying to control the uncontrollable. Dennis Brooks was drowning, and all the wealth in the world couldn't keep him from sinking. Days blurred into nights as Dennis remained by Owen's side, his mind a chaotic storm of desperation and denial. He had become a permanent fixture in the hospital, his powerful presence reduced to a grieving father clinging to false hope. Even the nurses had stopped trying to comfort him, their pity evident in their gentle but distant smiles. But someone else had been watching, someone far less noticeable but infinitely more determined. It was a stormy night when Dennis first heard the voice, a fragile whisper that cut through his exhaustion like glass. "Please, sir, I can save your son." Dennis's eyes shot up, his glare sharp and defensive. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was a girl who couldn't have been older than 12. Her clothes were worn and filthy, her hair tangled from days without care. Yet her eyes, those wide, unyielding eyes, held a clarity that startled him. "Who let you in here?" he snapped, his voice rough with grief and fury. "This is a hospital, not a shelter." The girl didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, her thin shoulders trembling but her gaze steady. "I know how to help him. I can feel it." Dennis shook his head, incredulous. Was this some kind of cruel joke? Another pathetic attempt to prey on his misery? His fists clenched. "Go away, I don't have time for this nonsense," but the girl didn't move. "Please," she repeated, her voice so calm it felt unnatural. "I can help him. Just let me try." His chest tightened. With frustration, what kind of sick world was this where even children tried to exploit his agony? With a snarl, he turned his back to her, his attention fixed once more on the steady, heartbreaking beeping of Owen's monitors. But the girl kept coming back. Every day she returned to the hospital, slipping past security with a skill born from living on the streets. And every day she would find Dennis and repeat those same words, "Please, sir, I can save your son." Her persistence began to unnerve him. How could a child be so stubborn, so convinced of her own ability to heal what the world's best doctors could not? And yet, no matter how harshly he dismissed her, she returned, unbroken and unwavering. What disturbed him most was the flicker of something he hadn't felt in weeks, a spark of hope. Dennis couldn't shake the girl's words from his mind. Her stubbornness had planted a seed of unease within him, one that only seemed to grow as the days dragged on. Owen's condition remained unchanged, his body frail and his breathing shallow. It was as if the boy's soul was slipping further away with each passing hour. In his desperation, Dennis had exhausted every resource imaginable. He'd flown in the world's most esteemed specialists, paid obscene amounts of money for treatments others could only dream of. He even considered the most experimental procedures, clinging to the empty promises of doctors eager to cash in on his misery. But nothing worked. Every attempt ended in failure. Every hopeful glance met with grim apologies and helpless shrugs. It was a nightmare from which he couldn't wake, a punishment his wealth and power couldn't shield him from. Late one night, he found himself standing alone in the hospital chapel, his hands trembling as he stared blankly at the stained glass windows. For a man who had always relied on logic and control, the idea of praying felt foreign, almost ridiculous. Yet there he was, his voice hoarse and cracked, begging an unseen force to save his son. But the silence that followed was deafening. Returning to Owen's room, Dennis sank into the stiff hospital chair, his eyes burning with sleeplessness. His gaze drifted toward the hallway where the girl always appeared, her words echoing endlessly in his mind. "Please, sir, I can save your son." A lesser man would have called it madness. But Dennis was beyond reason now. If there was even the slightest chance she could help, wasn't it his duty as a father to take it? He had thrown away millions on doctors and treatments, but the truth was that money couldn't buy hope, and hope was all he had left. Yet still, his pride resisted. How could he, Dennis Brooks, a man of immense power and influence, place his faith in a filthy child who claimed to have the answer to the one problem no one else could solve? It was absurd. But what choice did he have? His empire meant nothing if Owen didn't survive. His pride, his anger, none of it would matter if he lost his son. And so for the first time Dennis allowed himself to consider the unthinkable. Maybe the girl wasn't just a delusion brought on by his grief. Maybe, just maybe, she was his last chance. Dennis's resistance crumbled under the unbearable weight of his own helplessness. The endless cycle of doctors' visits and failed. Treatments had shattered whatever remained of his confidence. Desperation had finally overpowered his pride. The next time he saw her, waiting by the hospital entrance like a ghost refusing to be banished, he didn't bark orders for her to leave. Instead, his voice came out strained and low. "You keep saying you can help him. How?" The girl's eyes flickered with surprise, but her response was calm, almost soothing. "I don't have medicine or magic. But sometimes the body needs more than doctors. Sometimes it needs someone who truly cares, someone who understands." He wanted to scoff at her words, to dismiss them as childish nonsense. But there was something in her gaze, something raw and genuine that made him hesitate. Against every rational thought, Dennis found himself nodding. "Fine, you want to help? Come with me." He led her through the pristine, sterile corridors until they reached Owen's room. The girl paused at the door, her expression shifting from determination to something much softer. Fear, maybe. Or perhaps a grief far older than her years. "What's your name?" Dennis asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Grace," she whispered. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the doorknob. "But this isn't about me, it's about him." Dennis pushed the door open, his gaze never leaving her face. She stepped inside, her bare feet almost soundless on the cold tiles. Approaching Owen's bedside, she lowered herself into the chair where Dennis had spent so many sleepless nights. For a moment she just watched the boy, her expression unreadable. Then with trembling hands, Grace reached out and placed her palms gently on Owen's arm. Her touch was delicate, her fingertips barely brushing the child's skin. She began to speak, her voice soft and melodic, weaving words Dennis couldn't fully understand. It wasn't a prayer, nor was it any kind of ritual he recognized. It was something deeper, something that seemed to come from the very core of her being. Dennis stood frozen at the door, his fists clenched as doubt and hope warred within him. Everything about this moment felt absurd, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. Grace continued to speak to Owen, her words threading through the silence like a fragile lifeline. Dennis couldn't explain why, but there was something undeniably real about what was happening, a connection that went beyond medicine and logic. He didn't believe in miracles, but for the first time he wanted to. The hours crawled by, each second a grueling test of Dennis's dwindling hope. Grace remained by Owen's bedside, her small hands resting on the boy's frail arm, her voice a steady murmur of warmth and reassurance. What she said made no sense to him, but there was a tenderness in her tone that Dennis couldn't ignore. At first, nothing seemed to change. Owen remained as still and pale as ever, his breathing shallow and weak. Doubt crept back, into Dennis's mind, clawing at his sanity. What was he doing, letting a homeless child waste precious time with his son? But then something shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a slight twitch of Owen's fingers. Dennis's breath caught in his throat. Was it real, or just his desperate imagination playing cruel tricks? He edged closer to the bed, his eyes locked on his son's hand. Another twitch, this time more pronounced. His pulse quickened, hope igniting like a match struck in darkness. And then, as if summoned by Grace's unyielding faith, a hint of color returned to Owen's cheeks. Grace didn't flinch or celebrate. She simply continued speaking to Owen, her voice steady and calm. Dennis watched, his heart pounding with something he had almost forgotten how to feel. By the following morning, Owen's breathing had deepened, each inhale less strained than the one before. His chest rose and fell with a rhythm that seemed stronger, more natural. And when his eyelids fluttered, just for a moment, Dennis nearly collapsed from sheer disbelief. What did you do?" Dennis's voice cracked, the question stumbling from his lips. Grace looked up at him, her expression both exhausted and serene. "I didn't do anything special. I just gave him something to hold on to. Sometimes that's all a person needs." Her words left Dennis speechless. He sank into the chair beside her, his eyes never leaving Owen's face. For the first time since this nightmare began, hope didn't feel like a cruel illusion. Over the next few days, Owen continued to improve. His skin regained warmth, his breaths came easier, and even his doctors began to stammer with confusion and reluctant optimism. They couldn't explain it, but Dennis didn't care about explanations. All he cared about was the possibility that his son might survive. And through it all, Grace remained at Owen's side, her quiet devotion a force more powerful than anything Dennis had ever witnessed. Days turned into weeks, and against all expectations, Owen's strength continued to grow. His pale complexion now held a healthy glow, his once feeble breaths now calm and steady. Nurses and doctors exchanged puzzled glances, their scientific minds struggling to make sense of the impossible. But Dennis had stopped searching for explanations. His obsession with control and logic seemed almost laughable now. What truly mattered was his son's recovery and the undeniable role Grace had played in it. She rarely left Owen's side, her presence a constant source of calm for the boy. Dennis often found her humming gentle tunes or whispering softly to Owen, her voice like a lullaby that somehow reached deeper than medicine ever could. At first, Dennis watched her with guarded curiosity, but as the days slipped by, curiosity gave way to something warmer. Gratitude, yes, but also something more complex. Admiration, perhaps, or even respect. One evening, as Owen drifted into a peaceful sleep, Dennis finally broke the silence between them. "You never told me why you keep coming back," he said, his tone no longer laced with suspicion. "Why you care so much?" Grace looked down, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the hospital bed's edge. "Because I couldn't save her. My sister. She died in my arms last winter, cold, sick and hungry, and no one cared, no one even looked at us." The words hit Dennis like a punch to the chest. Guilt and shame twisted inside him, leaving him breathless. He had spent his life building wealth, towering skyscrapers and massive projects, but how many lives had his relentless ambition crushed along the way? He swallowed, his voice rough. "I'm sorry. I can't even begin to imagine that kind of pain." Grace glanced at him, her eyes holding no anger, only sadness. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad. I swore I'd never let another child feel that kind of loneliness if I could help it. That's why I couldn't leave." Dennis's throat tightened. He had seen courage before, corporate titans clawing their way to the top, ruthless competitors fighting for dominance. But this child's bravery, born from suffering and loss, was unlike anything he had ever encountered. "Grace," he said, his voice trembling, "I owe you more than I can ever repay." She shook her head gently. "You don't owe me anything, I just want him to get better." Dennis couldn't find the words to respond. Instead, he simply nodded, his eyes glistening with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Just as hope began to feel like something real, darkness struck again. It was a quiet night when Owen suddenly collapsed, his small body seizing with violent tremors before falling deathly still. Panic ripped through Dennis like a blade, his voice hoarse as he screamed for help. Doctors rushed in, their faces pale and urgent, as they wheeled Owen away for a battery of tests. Dennis's hands trembled uncontrollably, his mind racing with terror and helplessness. He had been foolish to believe the nightmare was over, that his son was safe. But it wasn't just his own terror that haunted him. Grace had been in the room when it happened, her face twisted with horror and guilt. Before Dennis could say anything, she fled, her frail form vanishing into the rain-soaked night like a shadow swallowed by darkness. Desperation drove him to the hospital's exit, his shoes slapping against the wet pavement as he stumbled into the downpour. The city's cold rain lashed against his face, but he didn't care. All he could think about was finding her, the child who had given him hope when he had nothing left. He shouted her name into the storm, his voice cracking from the force of his anguish. His search dragged on for hours, his feet aching, his suit soaked through. People stared but offered no help. Their indifferent eyes only reminded him of his own failures. Finally, in the dim glow of a street lamp, he found her. Curled under a shabby awning, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if trying to keep the world out. Her eyes were red-rimmed and haunted, her cheeks streaked with rain and tears. "Grace," Dennis choked out, his voice thick with emotion, "please come back. Owen needs you. I need you." She shook her head, her words almost lost to the howling wind. "I failed. He got worse because of me. I never should have interfered." "No," Dennis said firmly, kneeling down beside her. "You gave him something no one else could. You gave him hope. And you gave me something I didn't even know I needed." Grace stared at him, her gaze searching his, as if trying to measure the truth in his words. Dennis held her eyes, refusing to look away. "Please, Grace," he whispered, "come back with me. Let's face this together." And for the first time since Owen's collapse, Grace nodded. The walk back to the hospital was quiet, their footsteps echoing against the wet pavement. Dennis kept his arm around Grace's trembling shoulders, his own exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He had never realized how small and fragile she truly was until that moment. And yet, her courage far surpassed anything he had ever witnessed. When they returned, the lead doctor was waiting, his expression clouded with shame and discomfort. The look in his eyes made Dennis's stomach twist with dread. "Mr. Brooks, we need to talk," the doctor began, his voice shaky. "Your son, he's stable now, but there's something you need to know." Dennis's fists clenched. "Just say it." The doctor hesitated before continuing. "We were wrong. The initial diagnosis, it was completely incorrect. Owen wasn't dying. His symptoms were caused by a rare but treatable allergy that mimicked a terminal condition. We were so focused on finding something severe, given your wealth and influence. We wanted to find a solution that would justify our reputation. And because of that, we ignored the obvious." Silence crushed the room. Dennis felt his rage ignite, hot and merciless, but before the fury could consume him, his gaze drifted to Grace, the girl who had defied him, challenged him, and ultimately saved him from his own arrogance. The truth hit him with devastating clarity. Owen's healing hadn't been some mystical miracle. It was Grace's compassion, her relentless hope that had kept his son fighting. Her presence had brought light into a world Dennis had darkened with pride and resentment. He released a shuddering breath, his anger dissolving into something far more profound. Gratitude. Turning to Grace, Dennis sank to his knees before her, his voice breaking. I was lost. So consumed by anger and control that I couldn't see what truly mattered. You saved my son. But more than that, you saved me from myself. Grace looked away, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. I didn't do anything special. I just didn't want him to feel alone, like my sister did. The simplicity of her words struck him harder than any accusation. And at that moment, Dennis made a vow he intended to keep. In the weeks that followed, Owen made a full recovery, his laughter filling the hospital room where sorrow once reigned. Dennis kept his promise to Grace. He took her into his home, offering her not just shelter, but the family she had been so cruelly denied. And as a tribute to her kindness, Dennis established a children's wing dedicated to helping underprivileged kids, making sure that no child would ever feel abandoned or ignored. One afternoon, as Dennis, Owen and Grace strolled through a sunlit park, their laughter mingling with the gentle breeze, Dennis finally understood. The true miracle had never been about healing Owen's body. It was about learning to love, forgive, and change. For the first time in his life, Dennis Brooks felt truly wealthy. Years later, the children's wing of the hospital bore a plaque with a simple inscription, The Grace Foundation. Because every child deserves hope. Dennis Brooks stood in the bustling hallway, his eyes tracing the joyful murals painted along the walls. Laughter and life thrived here, where once there had been only silence and pain. Beside him, Grace, now a bright, compassionate teenager, guided a group of volunteers, her voice filled with warmth and determination. She had become everything. Dennis once failed to be selfless, kind, and unbreakable. As Owen, healthy and beaming, raced down the corridor to catch up with his sister, Dennis's heart swelled with gratitude. The true miracle had been Grace's courage to care when no one else would, and from that courage, a new legacy was born. If this story touched your heart even a little, consider joining our community by hitting that subscribe button. Your support helps us share more powerful stories that inspire, heal, and remind us all of the kindness that still exists in the world. And don't forget to like this video and leave a comment about what moved you the most. We'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with you. Together we can keep sharing messages of hope and compassion. Thank you for watching.